We also have that young people and educators have learned a lot, not just things that are measured by the current tests that they are subjected to. We know that today's young people are continuing to reckon with the socio-political climate brought about by issues such as school shootings, anti-LGBTQ legislation like the Don't Say Gay bill, the loss of reproductive rights, as well as affronts on voting rights, the continued grappling with COVID-19. No, we are not existing in a post-pandemic world yet. Attacks on public education, from book banning to threats to educators who are just attempting to teach accurate history. The list is long, and there are organized forces in the nation and across our communities that are threatening this vision of educational equity and justice, letting political rhetoric and harmful actions and policies get in the way of what matters most: protecting and improving a democracy in which we have a public education system that allows all of our children to be affirmed and to flourish, and allows educators to teach the truth about our country, including its beauty, as well as founding principles and flaws. Now, while this conversation is intentionally designed to occur just weeks prior to the upcoming midterm election, neither the topic nor the concerns are new. Attacks on teaching the truth have been taking place for several years. Some states like Florida and Texas get a lot of attention, but these attacks are also occurring in the New England region, right here in our communities. Today, we are grateful to shine a light on this region because some have characterized it as the canary in the coal mine. It is critical for us to hear from people whose daily efforts are close to these issues, to understand how to collectively support communities, schools, teachers, and our young people through advocacy, policy, civic engagement, resource, and knowledge sharing, so that our education system can be reimagined and designed as a public good that works for all. Now, some hopes as we all engage. I invite all of us to reflect on the intersection between our democracy and the preservation of the public education system as a public good. And as you listen, engage, and reflect, I also invite you to note of the connections to your own work and identify one or two opportunities for next steps, whether it's outreach to others or creating expanded space in your own circles for continued conversation and collaboration. I thank you for being here. Thank you for attending. Thank you for engaging. Now, the event is being recorded and will be emailed to all attendees post-session. We have an ASL interpreter. Thank you, Julie, for being here from Joyful Signing with us. Live captions are available and can be turned on. The chat is turned off, but there will be an opportunity to engage via polling. And we really invite you to follow the conversation on Twitter via #EdEquityTalks. I'll be back at the end to provide some very brief reflections and closing remarks. And before I hand it over to our partner, Jennifer Berkshire, to introduce our panelists today, I want to share that Jennifer writes about education and politics for The Nation, The New Republic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and other publications. Yes, she's busy. She's the creator and co-host of the Education Policy podcast, Have You Heard? And the co-author with Jack Schneider of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of School. If you haven't picked up your copy, I deeply encourage you to do so. Jennifer teaches in the journalism program at Boston College and in the education studies program at Yale University. As a licensed public school teacher, Jennifer lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts, right here in our region. With that, I thank you again for being here, and I will turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jelaine, for that comprehensive and very inspiring introduction. I absolutely love the way that you tied all of these issues together, because so often the education conversation gets told in a way that's separate from this larger question about the health of our democracy. So I now have the tall task of trying to follow in Jelaine's footsteps and doing some introducing of my own. So we have two expert panelists joining us today. I'm thrilled to get to be here with them. The first one I'm going to introduce is Paige Closhas-Parks. She's the Senior Policy Analyst for Rhode Island Kids Count. If you haven't heard of Rhode Island Kids Count, you absolutely should. They're a statewide children's policy and advocacy organization that works to improve the health, safety, education, economic well-being, and development of all the kids in Rhode Island. And they are particularly committed to equity and the unacceptable disparities by race, ethnicity, disability, zip code, immigration, status, neighborhood, and income. They are focused on a laser like eliminating those. Paige does a lot of stuff for Rhode Island Kids Count, including policy analysis, advocacy, and project management. And she's going to be drawing on all of those areas of expertise today as we grill her about the state of education and the discourse over equity in Rhode Island. Our next guest is Tina Kim Philibot, and Tina is an education equity advocate right up the border from me in New Hampshire. She's a leading advocate for educational equity, both in New Hampshire and nationwide. She joined the Manchester School District last summer as the district's very first chief equity officer. It's the first of its kind role in a public school district in New Hampshire. And in December 2021, in her individual capacity as a DEI director, she joined a lawsuit with the ACLU, the NEA, and a diverse group of attorneys from around New England in protest of New Hampshire's quote unquote banned concept laws. And we will be hearing more about that law in just a minute. Previously, she spent 13 years teaching English and dance at the high school level, and she has contributed to curriculum review committees for the New Hampshire Department of Education, the New Hampshire State Council on the Arts, and districts throughout the state. As you can tell from my introduction, I actually had to cut those intros short because they both had so many more accolades. And listeners and viewers, I want to let you know that we want to hear from you about how and where you're coming to this webinar, and you can answer some poll questions that Julita is going to throw up right now to give us an indication of how you're approaching these questions that we're about to ask. So Tina, my first question is for you. Jelaine talked about how there is this impression that somehow New England is kind of off the hook when it comes to these culture war issues. And I cannot tell you how often people say to me, aren't we lucky? Aren't we so fortunate that we are spared the kind of school board wars and political rhetoric that they have in, say, Florida and Arizona? And I'm always quick to remind them that, Massachusetts is actually the site of two of the lawsuits filed by parents protesting the very existence of trans students on the grounds that it violates their religious freedom. So when I'm countering this sort of bubbled sense people have about New England, I immediately point right over the border to where you are, New Hampshire. Now, keep in mind, this webinar is less than an hour long, and so you can't possibly detail all the things that have been happening in New Hampshire, but start by giving us an overview of this. What is this divisive concept law, and why were you so concerned about it?
Well, the divisive concepts law started as this thing called HB 544 in New Hampshire about 2 years ago now. And it pretty much mimicked the Trump era law banning training directed at DEI training during his time, which was found unconstitutional. So when it was HB 544, it was, again, almost mimicking that divisive concepts law, and lots of educators, lots of students, including my own daughter, and advocates for diversity, equity, inclusion, and a liberatory education went and gave testimony against it. So much so that it just became very clearly unpopular and it didn't go through. When it got to, but the folks who wanted this law through, the folks who wanted these banned concepts to be banned, actually were quite aggressive. And so what they did in the afternoon on a Friday is they revised the law just a little bit. They added an enforcement clause, which meant that if you were to defy this law as an educator, you would have your teacher certification removed. That was the addition. And then they attached it as a trailer bill to the House budget. So really what it did was say to our governor, you're either going to not pass the state budget because of this law, or you pass the state budget and it goes through. So what happens on June 25th, Governor Sununu signs that budget into law, including the banned concepts law. And then on June 28th, I actually get voted in to be the first DEI director at the largest public school district in the state, with the most diverse population in the state as well. So this is a part and parcel to a much larger assault on public education in terms of these voucher bills coming through to essentially privatize education. It comes, those have come through in New Hampshire. They're called education freedom accounts here in New Hampshire. And, you know, essentially at the end of the day, the law is limiting educators' ability to teach our curriculum, to help kids feel like they are represented in their curriculum. There are things that educators that we used to do just 2 years ago, right? Like teach, show the I Have a Dream speech. Now some educators feel compelled to send permission slips home to let parents know we're having this discussion. You're seeing books quietly being removed from the classroom. So it's as easy as, it's not like we're seeing these great big book bannings, right? It's an educator worried about, if I teach this book that I've been teaching, what if it opens a conversation and starts to kind of take us down this path that could defy this banned concepts law? I'm worried about that. People in my administrators are worried about that. I'm just going to teach a different book, or I'm not going to focus on this section. So no one is seeing this big, flashy kind of action of banning happening or changing our curriculum, but it is definitely absolutely quietly happening.
Paige, I want to bring you in. You were shaking your head somewhat despondently as Tina was describing the impact of this law. Now, in Rhode Island, things haven't gone quite as far, but we have seen similar bills animated by a similar spirit come before lawmakers. Talk about what they have tried to push through and what the response has been like.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer, for that question. And I first also want to thank Nellie Mae Education Foundation for hosting this really important conversation and for having me as a panelist. And Tina, thank you for all the work that you're doing in New Hampshire. So Rhode Island has seen very similar bills introduced. So just this past legislative session, there was a similar bill that was introduced that would have prohibited terms and instructional materials that depict identity groups as oppressors and others as victims. This bill also would have prohibited any kind of instruction that centered any race, ethnicity, gender, religion, or viewpoint. Within the bill, it also prohibited psychological or medical counseling in any school setting. It excluded gender identity and sexual orientation in sex education, and it required educators to use the names and pronouns associated with the student's biological gender instead of their gender identity. And it also included disciplinary measures for educators who violated those provisions. And so that legislation, it didn't pass out of committee. There was strong opposition to that bill, so it did not pass. But that's coming a year after we had a divisive curriculum legislation introduced the year before that. And that would have prohibited teaching of what was considered divisive concepts. and mandated that any contract, so similar to what was in New Hampshire, so any contract that the state went into, any grant, any training program, would have prohibited teaching of these, what they call divisive concepts, and prohibited making any individual feeling discomfort or guilt or anguish or any kind of distress as account of their race or their sex. So that bill also did not pass out of committee, but was introduced. So we do see these bills being introduced in Rhode Island. And then outside of our legislative process, we do see attacks in other forms of education. So in Rhode Island, we have a statewide school climate survey called SurveyWorks. It's administered every year to every student, to families, and to teachers and administrators. And it asks several questions around school climate. And 2 years ago, there was new questions that were added in that asked students about their curriculum. Do they see themselves and their culture and their race reflected in the curriculum? The question was added about how often are current events discussed in class? How often are you exposed to different races and cultures and viewpoints? And there was a lot of backlash around these new survey questions. There were folks calling for the survey to either be discontinued or to turn it into an opt-in only survey, which pays great risk around how many students will actually be able to take the survey if it moved to an opt-in option. And of course, this was extremely concerning because those questions are really important for us to understand how well schools are bringing students' voice and students' identities into their education, which we know students say is really important to them. But it also went to undermine student voice. So SurveyWorks is one of the very few ways that students and families can give feedback around the school climate. And this would have, really taken away really important opportunities for students and families to have a voice. So our SurveyWorks is still happening. It's still happening on an annual basis. It's extremely important information. So we're happy that our Department of Education continues to administer that survey, but we're watching very closely how these bills progress. And then also hearing what has happened in New Hampshire. We know it's really important to continue to be focused on this and to continue to work to ensure our schools are equitable and they reflect our increasingly diverse population.
Thanks, Paige. You have just set me up perfectly to transition to our next topic, which is really how do folks like you and the people who are in the audience, how do you manage to stay focused on these larger goals at a time of such intense backlash? And, I'm thinking about the wake-up call we got today about this long fallout from the pandemic. And so the role of schools has never been more important, more obvious, and yet a lot of the big fights right now are about things like, say, trans athletes, or the encouraging parents to report on students in New Hampshire. Tina, I want you to talk a little bit about your work in education equity in New Hampshire, and really, tell us what's gotten harder, but also if there are any glimmers of hope. What can you tell us that might shed light on the path forward, even in such a difficult time?
Thank you. Thank you for centering essentially what I think are our students, right? So I am coming out of the classroom about a year and a half outside of the classroom, and I miss working with my high school students a lot. So for me, in this new administrative position, I don't get that experience as much. So right now, I made a point that we're going to focus on developing student advocacy groups, creating clear pathways for students to really lean into sharing their experience in thoughtful, appropriate ways. When we talk about, kids are often saying to me across the state that kids of color don't feel like they're represented in the curriculum. They don't feel like their needs are being acknowledged in the curriculum. And then I explain what's happening with this law, and they have no idea it's going on, for one thing, right? Because it was very well crafted, because it's acting like an anti-discrimination law. So when they find out, oh, that's why my teacher kind of pivoted and changed the subject when we got into this conversation around race, they get angry. And the thing about students, it's like all of these big advocacy movements, came from students, right? Came from our kids. So for me, in terms of that inspiration, I go right to our students. You know, I think a lot of times kids, they do not get the credit for what they're willing to do and what they're willing to engage in. So there's that one piece. On a statewide level in New Hampshire, the Center for Justice and Equity was just recently launched about a few weeks ago. And this is a really important organization in New Hampshire, led by people of color, and really centering the needs of justice and equity in New Hampshire. It came from a long series through the Race and Equity series from the Endowment for Health, after years of building momentum for a full not-for-profit that's going to just lean into and advocate and support people like me who are doing this work, and our students too. So there's a lot of energy in New Hampshire to get this work supported, to make sure that the lawsuit I'm involved in is people are aware of it, and that educators feel supported to do their jobs. Yeah.
That's so great to hear. And Paige, some of this probably sounds familiar to you because Rhode Island is definitely a space where student-led activism has really been having an impact over the last few years. I'm thinking about the court case that they waged about civics in schools. So there was momentum in Rhode Island. And now, as you were telling us earlier, something as seemingly clear-cut as collecting data through a survey is suddenly being contested. Give us a sense of what the momentum was like and what possibility there is to keep that alive today.
Yeah, so great question. And Tina's absolutely right about having young people that are informed and empowered, because they're really leading in this work, and they're pushing us as adults to speak up and be brave and to hold us accountable as advocates as well. So there's a lot of movement happening in Rhode Island, and we are really fortunate to have a really strong group of youth empowerment organizations that have been doing the really important work of finding young people from all different backgrounds and really giving them the tools they need to be able to be their own best advocates. So in these organizations, young people are studying power and race and class, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression. They're practicing public speaking skills. They're exercising their own leadership. They're learning strategic thinking skills, critical thinking skills. I mean, these young folks know how to read policy, they're reading budgets, and they're learning how to mobilize their peers. And you're right. So we had a court case, Cook versus Raimondo, which many of our youth were in that case, where they sued the state for providing improper civics education. And although that lawsuit didn't end up with a win, it definitely pushed legislators to really look at what is our civics education requirements. And just last year, we did have a bill passed that requires civics to be taught in school, and that was all from the young people. So I want to give a shout out to some of our youth organizations in Rhode Island. So there's the Alliance of Rhode Island Southeast Asians, or ARISE, Providence Student Union, Youth in Action, Young Voices, Youth Pride, the Providence Youth Student Movement, the Rhode Island Urban Debate League. We also have youth members of Black Lives Matter, Rhode Island. I mean, these young folks are really engaged. They're really pushing us as adults to be better advocates. So that's a really important piece of why these harmful bills haven't passed in Rhode Island. We also have advocacy organizations like us at Rhode Island Kids Count and many others who have close relationships with the youth organizations and grassroots movement, because we have the ability to track and monitor legislation. As Tina said, earlier, that some bills are introduced like at the last minute. It's really hard to track bills and legislation. Things happen really quickly. So in our role at Rhode Island Kids Count, we're really happy to use our capacity to let organizations know, community-based organizations know when bills are being introduced, when hearings are happening, because they're ready to go. So we just need to let them know when the information is out there. And we also have equity champions in our General Assembly. We have a really increasingly diverse General Assembly, more diverse than ever before. Our Black and Latino caucus is working really hard on the inside to move a lot of this equity work within policy. And we have white allies in our General Assembly who are also really vocal and not afraid to speak up in opposition to these harmful bills. And then we also have funders like Nellie Mae, who are helping organizations that are on the ground to be able to be prepared for when these bills are introduced. And all those things together really allow for strong opposition when these really harmful and hate-filled bills are introduced. So we're continuing on the momentum, continuing to work with youth organizations, helping them expand their capacity as well. Because although we had these great wins, we know it's not over. So we need to continue to work together and mobilize together.
Well, speaking of funders, we have some in the audience, and I would imagine that there are a fair number of folks, both with us today and also, around the country, wondering, what the hell do I fund now, right? That a number of what seemed like clear-cut policy goals just 5 years ago are now, under heated debate. And because both of you are in this unique situation where you're so close to what's happening on the ground, but also seeing, sort of what's happening at the organizational level. I wonder what your thoughts are if you had a chance to sit down with a funder who's trying to figure out what their direction should be. What advice might you give them? And Tina, let's start with you.
I have some advice, that's for sure. First of all, I really appreciate the direction of philanthropy and this kind of move toward this trusting philanthropy, right? Where a lot of times our grants are coming with very deep expectations and that deep reporting, right? And with the trusted philanthropy philosophy, it's this notion of trusting people of color to know what's best for us, right? And to be able to move a program forward in a way where we get to focus on the program, on helping people of color, on helping our BIPOC communities versus reporting and abiding by this structure. Some of the funding pieces that I've been working a lot to develop a pathway for educators of color and for BIPOC folks to enter the education community. I think it's really important that we have representation in our schools. Whereas, the majority of the teaching profession is mostly still upwards of 85% white folks. So that's something that's been really important, supporting educators of color, supporting people of color who are building these programs. I want to get to the student advocacy groups too. I mean, we have some really amazing work that's going on here in New Hampshire. And I see at the YWCA in Manchester, the Advocate Me program. So direct youth-led organizations that the other piece I wanted to mention too is the NAACP Manchester is doing Saturday school. So essentially it's the history of the United States of America accurately delivered and including voices from our Black community, our Asian American community, all of these, the real history, right? So leveraging organizations. So my thing is that people of color who have been doing this work on the ground for decades, right? Who continue to do this work, right? When we show up with a program to support people of color and helping to get that program across the finish line. And it's not just money, right? It's helping through that really complicated process. And the other one, again, is to focus in on where are the programs that are directly supporting our students of color, right? The ones where our students of color that are leveraging their ability to engage and having a voice. So like what Paige was saying, offering the tools, offering the education. And then when it's time to show up and present, it's the kids who get to drive how they show up, how they lead this work for us. And we as adults get to say, what do you need and how can we support you?
It's great. And it's such a good reminder that for all of the attention that groups like, say, Moms for Liberty or Parents Defending Education get, that there are these local groups involved in a pushback and that we really need to hear more from them and about them. Paige, you mentioned some funding initiatives in Rhode Island that that you think are playing a positive role. Tell us a little bit more and talk directly to funders about how they might support your work.
Yeah, so I think it's really important for funders to trust communities and trust young people, as Tina said. And I think what I really appreciate about Nellie Mae's approach is it allows young people to come up with and decide what their goals are and they decide the policy goals. And at Ryan Kids Count, we take their lead. Let us know what young people are, what impacts them the most, what is on their day-to-day struggle. And as adults, we can try to help to connect that to what does that mean policy-wise. But it comes from young people first. They are the ultimate consumers of this policy, and they know the best about how policy is implemented. So not coming in with a preconceived notion about what the work is, allowing that work to come from the community. I think it's also important for funders to allow some flexibility. So we've already mentioned that, you know, when these bills come up, it's kind of a whoa, like what is this bill introduced? And oh my gosh, there's a hearing in 2 days about it. And sometimes organizations just need to stop what they're doing for a minute, so they're able to really respond and be engaged and to support young people. And these committee hearings are really, really difficult. They're emotionally difficult. Young people are asked to talk about their own personal lives. We're talking about traumatic events that have happened to them. And sometimes those committee members are not listening, or they can be disrespectful at times. And we're asking young people to put themselves in those experiences. And so it's important for funders to realize really what's being asked of the community, what's being asked of young people, and to provide them with the time and space, one, to prepare for those instances, and then to also recover from them. So to allow space and funding and flexibility to allow that to happen is extremely important. And then implementation. So when you do have some positive bills that go through, it can look really great and we have a victory and we celebrate for a minute. And then those policies have to be implemented. And many times funders may be really excited about the win, but might not be as aware about how long it takes to really follow the implementation and the continued accountability that needs to happen all along the way. It could take years and years and years of continuing to advocate within state departments or local education agencies, or even within certain departments within the school department, to make sure that a policy is really being implemented with the full intent. And that takes a lot of work as well. So I encourage funders to also think about not just the win, think about what does it take to follow the implementations through.
Along, we're taking feverish notes as the two of you were talking, because you both had so many excellent and very specific ideas about what would be helpful right now. Tina, I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You've mentioned a couple of times how vitally important it is right now that we center kids. And I know this is something that I'm guilty of in my own work, that, you know, as I do podcasts and write about the backlash, I'm very focused on the politics. I'm very focused on the adults. And, you know, I can tell you all about what teachers are going through. But the effect of all of this has been, in many ways, in profound ways, to actually silence kids. Can you sort of paint us a picture of what, you know, sort of what has been the impact of the backlash on kids in New Hampshire? And also, how can we just make absolutely sure in our advocacy work and in the, you know, among the funders who support that work, that we keep that spotlight on the kids?
You know, Paige had mentioned this idea of students are in these spaces doing this advocacy work and oftentimes sharing their stories of racial trauma in that space to heal is really important, right? So Nellie Mae just put out a grant around restorative practices, right? So that part for our students, I think the idea of, you know, this isn't the first time that racism is happening at our kids, right? It has been happening, and now it is just that much more. It's just the assault is just, it can feel to the point where you're going to lose some hope, right? And that's the part for me that advocacy for our students is so important. It helps hold on to that sense of hope. It helps provide community. So the part about creating spaces that are restorative, that are healing, where kids get to be in spaces that they're driving the conversation. And I'm losing my train of thought a little bit because I just get excited when we're talking about making sure that the kids get to drive the conversation. So the effect on kids have been to, and especially after COVID, when I'm not seeing myself as a student reflected in the educators in front of me, when I'm not seeing the issues that I care about and that I live every day, being able to have those conversations in class, right? I come to school to see my friends then, right? When I don't feel like I have the ability to, when I don't feel like I belong, when I don't feel like I can contribute as a student to my learning environment, why do I engage in these spaces, right? So in terms of that, we talk about curriculum like it's this thing that's completely divorced from kids sometimes because it's always adults building this thing, right? But you're right in terms of kids being the consumers of our curriculum. So what does it look like for kids to engage in having a little agency in what they learn, right? And right now, I don't think our students feel like they have agency in their own learning. There are opportunities that are coming, these student advocacy groups, finding groups in our communities who are doing this work like NAACP Manchester and everything. And I'm also saying is, hey, we can do that in the schools, right? We can do that in the schools. We can do that right now. Law aside, right? It's still present. I recognize that piece, right? And that being said, our kids need to feel seen, heard, valued, like they belong. And I think that these laws are saying, especially to students of color, right, that you don't belong, right? That this idea of unconscious or conscious bias, that's a part of our law in New Hampshire, right? That's not something that we can teach, right? The reality is that stereotypes and bias exist. So when we're not able to have that conversation about racism, about our LGBTQ, what's happening to our students, the laws that are coming across the finish line, right? That really limits our ability of our kids to be able to live in their whole and full humanity. So what, you talk about these banned concepts laws, they're just essentially saying to kids, like, you don't get to be your full self. They're saying to teachers, you don't get to create spaces where kids get to bring their full humanity into this environment. I do feel like there's hope. We have an opportunity here to really help students become advocates and agents in their own lives, support educators in doing that work. The problem is that it's real hard to see, like the kids, like you were talking about Moms for Liberty. In New Hampshire, what happened is the Department of Education, in an effort to kind of streamline this process of reporting on this law, they put on there on the Department of Education website, the New Hampshire Department of Education website, a much more streamlined process. Here's a piece of paper that will help you complete this complaint, right? And once that happened, immediately the Moms for Liberty group in New Hampshire put out a $500 bounty for the person who gets a teacher written up by this law to get their teacher certification revoked. Our kids are seeing that. They're seeing that real people are putting money, that they're being threatening, they're operating in ways that are just, that certainly isn't how you make people feel like they belong. That cannot be the model for how our kids create advocacy. And they're looking at that and they're judging, right? They know that this is not behavior becoming of an adult, right? So they're just saying, you know what, we're going to do it better. We're going to do it with more generosity, with more compassion, and we're going to be able to sustain it. So that's the part where I have hope for our students, and they are not going to back down. The other thing too, in terms of these healing spaces for students, this work is emotionally laborious. It is hard, and it is a part of my identity as a person of color, their identity of people of color, right? And I want to kind of go back to this idea of building capacity for the work, that it doesn't just look like this traditional look of advocacy, but it also looks like these radical healing spaces too. And so for our kids right now, we're really working hard to create those spaces, these affinity spaces where kids can have these bigger conversations with each other. and facilitated in a way that feels thoughtful and responsible. So it's a little bit more than we probably wanted.
No, I think it's so essential. And I can imagine that Paige is listening to this and, just the idea that this is the role that your Department of Education would play. And Paige is probably thinking, thank goodness I'm not in New Hampshire. But then on the other hand, it's not like, Rhode Island isn't off the hook either, right? We got this very stark wake up call today about just how much deeper the disparities have gotten. So in some ways, there's an urgency to your work that's even greater. And so I'm wondering how, given all the things we've been talking about and all the challenges that you've been focused on all along, what do you think, what are the priorities going forward? And if you're able to let students themselves drive some of those priorities, where do you see that going?
Well, you're right. There are, after I hear some of our colleagues in New Hampshire speak, I do have those moments where I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how they continue to wake up every morning and keep doing this work. So Tina, thank you for continuing to do this work. Because you're right. It's extremely, I find that very laborious here in Rhode Island. I can't imagine what it's like when your whole identity is attacked. Sounds like 24/7. But in Rhode Island, though, it does mean that we can't get complacent and just be like, oh, okay, we're not that bad. No, New Hampshire didn't just suddenly end up this way. It always starts somewhere. And so we need to be really mindful in Rhode Island and continue to be bold around our demands for equity and race equity, and to be able to talk about the impact of systemic racism in our education. And yes, we have that data. And unfortunately, the NAEP scores that were released today tell us the story that we already know, right? That there are large disparities by race, ethnicity, and language status, immigration status, by neighborhood, by zip code in our state. Rhode Island is no anomaly to that. And those disparities have just gotten deeper, which means our work just needs to continue on, and to do so even more boldly. We need to be innovative. We need to think of new ideas. We need to be uncomfortable. We need to push ourselves and our colleagues to continue to be uncomfortable, to have these hard conversations so that we can really push this work forward. I also think it's really important for us in Rhode Island to know that our young people are watching us, and they're looking to see what we're doing, and looking to see how are we and how loudly are we coming out in opposition to these harmful and hate-filled policies, or to race-blind policies. I have heard from young people identify as trans, around their fear, the fear that they experience and feel every day leaving their homes, being out trans kids, even though they may be in a school environment which is pretty open and affirming, even when they have really inclusive and safe school administrators. Just what's out there in the world and in the news and in social media, it is overwhelming, and it brings fear for our young people. So that's why it's even more important for all of us to speak up, for school staff to speak up. Our kids are watching. They want to know if you are standing with them, because they need that. They need that strength. And we can help them, because our young people are incredible. They have really important things to say, and we need to let them know and provide them safe spaces to do that. So I don't know if I answered your question, Jennifer.
Oh, yeah.
But that's what's been on my mind and heart very much.
Yes. And it's, I feel like that both of you are just doing such a great job of really showing us what it looks like when you give kids the space to lead, and how we're going to end up in a very different place than the one that we might choose on our own. In the few minutes we have left, I want to just switch gears and talk a bit about the midterms. Tina, you talked about how unpopular that original divisive concepts bill was. People might be really surprised to hear how deeply unpopular all this stuff is in New Hampshire. That when in the school board races last fall, the folks who ran on anti-CRT platforms and quote unquote gender ideology were pretty handily defeated. I wonder if you have any prediction about the midterms and whether education is going to play a role in it.
Yeah, education is definitely being named in terms of defending public education in the state. I would encourage all of the folks who are running for office who are saying we're here to defend public education to come on into the schools and see what it looks like on the ground. And I think that will give you even more energy to understand what's happening and what's at stake here. I think that, I'll be honest, right? It is my hope that we will continue to have legislators and representatives who are going to work to defend public education and to support student voices. And still, this law still got across the finish line, right? If we think for 1 second that we can slow down or take a breath, and that's the part that's exhausting, right? This is not letting up. It continues to come, right? This law that got through gave momentum to some folks, right? So what you're seeing at school board meetings, or people are showing up there, and it seems to be a vocal minority of people who are, you know, this anti-CRT movement and everything, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And for us as educators and and our students seeing this all play out, it's a lot. And so to speak to the midterms, it's not the first time that education is being exploited for this political next step, right? So I think, honestly, who knows how this shakes out? We have some pretty tough runs in New Hampshire. And, you know, we have a lot of opposition to the work that I do in New Hampshire, the work that my fellow DEI directors. So now there are 3 of us in the state of New Hampshire, and it's pretty deep. And it's my hope that we'll be able to come to the point like we did last year to be able to say, this is what you're doing is not okay. And also it's a pretty aggressive attack. So I don't have a great answer.
Was really just my personal interest. I'm
Yeah.
a little obsessed with New Hampshire. And someone sent me a great picture of a big sign by the side of the road that said public education is on the ballot. So I think you're absolutely right. And Paige, I'm going to give this last question to you. You talked briefly about that civics lawsuit. And one of the things that we have really gotten out of the habit of is thinking about and talking about our schools as training grounds for democracy. And in some ways, Rhode Island is an exception to that because the students that you've been talking about pushed back and said, you know what, the education we're getting is too narrow. We want to be trained to lead. Tell us, and it feels to me like a bright spot for the future. So with this time when even the title of our webinar is Democracy in Peril, give us something to feel hopeful about.
Well, I think we all should feel hopeful that our young people haven't given up hope, and that they know and feel and believe that they can make change, and that we just need to give them the power to do that. So as adults, I know we can feel like, oh my gosh, you're like spinning the wheel or we're not making enough progress. But our young people are just like, yes, we're not making enough progress. And so we got to push harder. We have to keep going. So, and our young people, if we give them the tools and we give them the information, give them the platform, they're going to be the ones to really pick up the mantle and go further than we've been able to. And so that gives me a lot of hope. The passion that I see our young people have, their commitment to equity gives me a lot of hope, and their willingness to do whatever it takes to make that happen. I mean, our young people, for the defendants in this court case, that's a lot of work. That's being extremely brave. That's taking risks, and they did it not only for themselves, but for all the young people of Rhode Island. And it's such this beautiful selflessness that's going into this work from our young people. So I hope that gives us all hope.
Paige and Tina, you're both such amazing advocates. And I know that I just peppered you with questions. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you'd like to just briefly mention before we hand it back to Ghislaine?
Just one thing is that, so myself and Andres Mejia in the NEA AFT are involved with this lawsuit. And just to let educators and students know, there are people who are going to bat for this. We will continue to stay out in front of this so that our teachers don't have to. And that part about the hope that Paige is talking about, like, hold on to that. That's what gets us through the day. And that hope, that building of hope and securing of hope, that's education. That's it. And it's real. So, and also I want to thank Nellie Mae and thank everyone, Paige and yourself, Jennifer, for being in this space and creating an environment where we can have these conversations. It's super important. Appreciate it.
Anything you want to add, Paige?
Just to thank everyone for, spending this hour of your evening to really listen into this conversation. I'm really looking forward to having the work move beyond the Zoom platform and seeing everyone's work in action, and hope that we can, continue to stay in touch and really encourage each other and support each other as we do this important work moving forward. So thank you.
Just to let people know, we're going to put up one more poll so that you can help determine what Nellie Mae should focus on next. But for right now, we are going to focus our attention on Ghislaine, and hopefully her parting remarks will be as inspiring as her opening remarks.
I cannot follow Paige and Tina, Jennifer. Like, that's just impossible. And Paige, Tina, just really thank you. Thank you for the work that you do daily. And we know that that work does not come without exhaustion and great cost. Thank you for breaking down the complexities and the urgency of this moment, and for so expertly connecting public education, the power of young people, to the larger context of this democracy that's struggling. And personally, it was really heartening to hear so many references to the incredible work happening across communities in the New England region, including many that we as the foundation partner with. That was really humbling. And you equipped us with ways to act, with glimmers of hope, which can be challenging in this moment in time, and a renewed sense of urgency. So thank you. Jennifer, thank you so much for your meaningful and engaging facilitation. We could have kept going for another hour. Julie, thank you for making this conversation accessible to more members of our community. I was taking furious notes because I felt like I was taken to school over the last 45 minutes. And I'll end by saying that at the foundation, we really are invested in working in partnership with young people, with grassroots organizations, with communities, with educators, and with policy and advocacy leaders and other partners, because it really, quite frankly, takes all of us to support the health of our democracy and public education. And recently, we've made several grants to support civic engagement efforts that we believe will counter the types of harmful and hate-filled, thank you for that language, Paige, bills and laws and policies that we heard about today. And as both Paige and Tina mentioned, this is a long game, right? That was one of my takeaways. It's not just about mobilizing and organizing and obtaining wins, but we, especially as funders, must think about sustained implementation that lead to real change and equitable and just outcomes. So that is a takeaway. So we encourage our funder colleagues on the call to connect with your community members to learn about ways that you can partner with them with adequate funding, because resources are always a challenge, preferably in the form of general operating support. We encourage you to use your influence, your voice, your platforms, and taking the lead of young people and leaders like Paige and Tina by trusting communities, by providing cover, because as funders, quite frankly, we stand the least amount of risks in this work. And we encourage you to create opportunities for rest, for healing, for restoration, because this work carries great cost. Tina and Paige reminded us of that today. So let us continue to center the voices of our young people, which means sharing, wielding, giving up power, which, I must say, can often feel uncomfortable to folks who are used to holding power. And again, we heard we cannot be complacent. Our young people, our educators are leading and watching how we show up And how we engage civically and politically has implications for the kinds of representatives and the kinds of legislators that tackle the issues that we've been talking about. Public education is indeed on the ballot. Thank you for that, Jennifer. And with that, I thank all of you for engaging, and let's keep this work going. Thank you, everyone.